The evening's oral part of festivities, and I hereby respond to the demand. I look around, I'm really amazed to see how fresh all of you look, considering what you've been through. And it can only be explained by two factors: your youth and the inspiration that Israel offers. Karen has done its best, and I'd like to take this occasion to thank Paul Baer, who is so dedicated. With all his heart and soul, as you all know. I'd like to take cognizance of the presence of Mrs. Leah Dole, the Deputy Chairman of our English-speaking department, all that's been going on and has tried very hard to be of help. And I want to thank Rena for lending her charming presence. And I want to thank Mr. Roga, who's here, for trying his best not to keep your visit secret completely from the public. And if I have omitted somebody, I apologize herewith. And now I'm ready to start the evening a little bit more formally by saying Dr. and Mrs. Herzog, Mr. and Mrs. Silver, Dr. and Mrs. Small, ladies and gentlemen, I saw you when you arrived, and now I have the pleasure of greeting you as you are about to leave. So I say, Bruchim atem v'achem, Bruchim atem v'tzeitchem. I'm sure that none of you is the same as he or she was a week ago when I first greeted you. You've had a visit which has been, I am told, instructive and transporting in both senses, and inspiring, and of course fraught with a variety of fortune. Some things we could have perhaps avoided, and other things we could not have avoided. Those things that happened which were avoidable or not too pleasant, naturally the Karen Ayesod has to take the responsibility for. All the other things, I think, must be considered an act of God, such as your trip to by air today over the Sinai. And who am I to complain against an act of God, especially in the presence of a more orthodox colleague like Dr. Hertzog? So we just let go at that. I have heard some very good news about your visit in many respects, and of course my eye now rests. I didn't notice it before, just where we were sitting. Aryeh Krause, we're delighted to see you here, because Aryeh is the man who thinks up and works up the various projects in which some Canadians have already interested themselves, and more will, and we don't have a more dedicated person. And I should have said, Achron Chaviv, the man who is my Rebbe, with regard to matters affecting the Canadian UIA, and that is Saul Granick. And without Saul, I don't know where we would have been in planning this or any other visit affecting a Canadian group. Now, I think the last thing that I said in relation to the act of God was by way of an apology for shaking you up as we did on your trip today, and not enabling you to see all that might have been seen. But there is an easy remedy, ladies and gentlemen. All you have to do is come back again, and you'll have better luck the next time. I said that we heard some very good news about your delegation, and it is a tribute to the leadership of Nat Silva. And I don't want to speak here in riddles, so I'll say to Ya'akov and Penina Hertzog, that this group, under their leader, came together one day and decided they would like to do something right here on the spot to give expression to what this visit has already meant to them. And the expression they gave took the form of an increase on the part of those represented here, the men represented here, an increase over 1967 to the extent of 55% from the group here. It is the best result we've had percentage-wise from any group thus far who have visited us, and we have had encouraging signs from the French when they were here and from others. But this, I think, so far is the climax, and for that, a hearty yasher koach to you, and may this be an augury of what will happen with the others in your community. I know that every one of you is going to tell his and her story and his and her way, and this will be a source of tremendous stimulation. And what even delighted me more was to hear that the ladies, and this I think sets a new precedent for the visits to Israel on the part of the wives of the delegates. The ladies on their own, under the leadership of Mrs. Small, got together one day and produced a very respectable sum, which I'm sure is going to be a precedent for the womanhood of Toronto Jewry. Now, every one of you is authorized, therefore, to come home and tell the story to his own friends, to his family, to his circle of business acquaintances, because this is what is required. The stimulation from those who come with a special authority because they have been to Israel, they have seen, and they know firsthand what it is that they are talking about. And I would also like to hereby appoint all of you members of a very important group which belongs to the infantry department. We need men and women to cover the great potentials that you have, the many additional prospects which 1967 has uncovered, and therefore you are hereby appointed a special kind of Sahal, which means Sva Halicha Lamagvit. The military force, the paratroopers, whose job is to do the infantry work for the sake of this emergency appeal. I was very amused to learn from my charming neighbor on my right, Mrs. Small, about the way in which you experienced your Tu B'Shvat. And this of interest, I think, Dr. Mrs. Hertzog, I was told that instead of planting a tree, they planted a bus. The bus got stuck on the butts, theirs was planted, and they had their problem. A red bus. Well, it really should have been a blue and white bus. And I want you to know what I did on Tu B'Shvat, together with some friends of mine, thanks to Yitzhak Rogov and Perry and others who arranged it. We took a trip to a sort of weatherproof part of Israel called the Arava. And we took some journalists along with us. And we wanted them to see some of the outposts that zone which is not the safest zone in Israel. And to me, who have lived here now for 8 years, I've been talking about Israel, I guess, for the last 50, it was an inspiration not only to be in Grofit and Yotfata and Ein Yahav and so on, but to talk to the people who were there in those exposed, dangerous positions, and to find out who were the settlers. Most of the settlers were the sons of kibbutzniks, and they left the kibbutzim of their parents because they were looking for something more challenging, for something more dangerous, for something more indispensable for the future of Israel. This was the revolt of youth in Israel in the year 1969. And when I compared it in my mind with some of the revolt that one sees in the Western world on the part of youth, where they're looking for some escapist experience, a self-induced or drug-induced euphoria in order to escape the responsibilities of life, and you compare it with this phenomenon here, where these youngsters thought that the kibbutzim of their parents were a little bit too safe, and they wanted to go to the Arava, I thought to myself, Ashrei ha'am shekach lo. Wonderful is the people, blessed is the people that has such youth. Well, this is all that I wanted to say tonight, because we came to hear the speaker of the evening. I know how much you've admired Dr. Hertzog, knows your community well, and I was really rejoiced to see the reaction of Pnina to the opportunity of being here and meeting old friends who loved and admired her when she was in Canada at the side of her distinguished husband. And we love and admire her here. Dr. Hertzog, I think, when he came to serve as ambassador of Israel in Canada, brought with him the Amtachto in his bag, perhaps as rich a combination of gifts as any one man can be expected to have. And now that he serves in Israel as the director of the Prime Minister's office and his advisor on many important affairs, was organized so brilliantly our two most successful conferences, one dealing with economic matters and the other dealing with education and aliyah and Israel diaspora relations. We in Israel cherish him as much as you did in Canada, and more than that one cannot possibly say. A combination of Torah and Chokhmah, and so I have a great personal pleasure as well as an official privilege and honor to present Dr. Ya'akov Hertzog.
States, and now occupies a pivotal position in diaspora's relations, and indeed in this vast stirring of Jewish consciousness across the world as we unite as never before. I also greet my dear friends from Toronto, Mr. and Mrs. Nat Silver, whose leadership I've known from my days in Canada, whose hospitality I enjoyed last year, Dr. and Mrs. Small, Mr. and Mrs. Grannick, and I invited here a friend of mine from New York, who's done a lot for Israel, Mr. Mendel Aviv. Now, Dr. Goldstein set the tone for this evening by speaking of the transition, the metamorphosis, the change of thought and impression, which he naturally assumed you have had since the day you landed in Israel, and tonight, as you bid us farewell, if indeed it can be called a farewell. And indeed, this metamorphosis of thought and feeling, which I assume, as he assumed, has been compressed in this week, symbolizes a feeling and a sense of change, and indeed a sense of the unknown, which affects the Jewish people across the world. It's my privilege as political advisor to the Prime Minister to travel often abroad in various countries and various climes, and always I'm struck by a dichotomy in this new epoch of Jewish history now unfolding. I come from the chancelleries of power, of the foreign offices, from meeting with princes, with statesmen, with editors of great newspapers, surveying all sorts of assessments and contacts throughout the Middle East. I always have the privilege of coming back to my brethren and trying to feel with them this intuitive strength, this new source of faith, which gives us the capacity to face up as united people to a vast world in a situation which can only be described in cosmic terms. Wherever you go, the Jewish people, with Israel as its focus, has assumed a new dimension in world consciousness. This affects the entire balance of world power, whether it be Peking, Moscow on the Middle East, Moscow, Belgrade, Moscow, Bucharest, Moscow, Warsaw, Moscow, Budapest, East-West relations, Washington, Moscow, the last vestiges of British power in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, the attempt of France to regain position on the world scene within the category of the Gaulls of personality and French policy as it sees to at least reclaim the vestiges of a lost empire in the minds and thoughts of the peoples of North Africa and the Middle East. It affects the entire neutralist bloc of the United Nations, which stood by Nasser in the early days, but after the Czech crisis has been crumbling apart. It affects your country, Canada, which has shown constant friendship to us within the Western bloc of friends, of which I shall shortly speak. But even deeper than this contemporary balance of forces which lies in the unknown day by day, even deeper it has cosmic spiritual qualities, as with Jerusalem reunified and the Jew having found his roots again in history, or at least the beginnings of these roots, he faces up to vast spiritual forces across the world which survey him with reverence, touched with antagonism, but above all, underlying uncertainty as to the future. I refer to the dialogue with Christianity after close to 2,000 years, now renewed. And I have the privilege often to go to Rome to conduct this dialogue and stand aghast at the reverence, at this new look, at this new perspective with which we are watched by princes of the Catholic Church as they try, without discussing theology, the instructions of the Pope, carrying on the dialogue in diplomatic terms, to plumb the depths of the nature of this Renaissance. What can it mean in terms of world history? This tiny, humiliated people, after close to 2,000 years, within merely 25 years having marched from Auschwitz, from the gas ovens of destruction, from a situation in total despair, from total blackness, suddenly overnight to control the arteries of world power in the Suez Canal and describe the Middle East, which is the cross point of world communications and indeed holds within it the key to the balance of world power. How can I describe to you this cosmic quality? I was in London some months ago and was discussing with the publisher a book he was bringing out for young people in England on major events of world history. What should a boy or girl of 16 or 17 in England, not Jewish, know of the nature of world history? What events are crucial? And this publisher, one of the great publishing houses of the world, he asked me would I answer a few questions to the professor of history who was writing this book. He came in to see me in London. And he said, you know, I'm looking somehow or other to give the Jews some representation in my book. He told me a few personalities and events we discussed. But then he said he had a great problem, because many Jewish friends of his in Cambridge University had urged upon him to include the destruction of the temple, the Jewish temple, 900 years ago, in the vocabulary of work. But he said, I'm a realist, I'm a world historian, I'm not a Jew. For you, it was an event of enormous significance. But I have studied the span of world history, and when your temple was destroyed, the Lahavdil, this I say, he did not say the word Lahavdil, so many sacred houses of worship were destroyed in the ancient world. The Middle East was in ferment. In the Far East, Mongols were entering China for a further millennia of world history. Across the Roman Empire, the legions of Rome fought down tribe after tribe from modern England, the area which is modern England, right through Europe to North Africa. It is true indeed, as I've read, that it cost the Roman Empire 2 legions to break down the resistance of the small tribe of Israel. It is true that the commander of the legions, in reporting the battle to the Roman Senate, did not describe the welfare in the usual accepted terminology of his troops as having been without mishap, which was the usual message. But after all is said and resaid, he said, you may think that by your resistance you caused a dent in the Roman Empire. But in realistic terms, this is nonsense. You are just one more tribe facing the vast might of Rome and overwhelmed. And how can I include in such a history then the destruction of your temple as an event of world significance? I told them that extraneously, in the superficial immediate sense, he was right. But I told them of talks in Rome. I told them of the fact that cardinals great in the church, in the Catholic Church, had told me that they could not discuss this issue in theological terms, the rise of Israel. For if they were to do so, they would have to take at the very roots of the fabric of their theology over close to 2,000 years. For here lay some miraculous renaissance which is beyond the analysis of human ken. And therefore, as they approach the problem of Jerusalem, the idea of the Jew being in Jerusalem, being once more integrally part of that city of endless prophecy and inspiration, and of that city being identified, maybe, they said, whereas we say certainly for all time again with the Jew. As they contemplated, they faced problems which could shatter the essential fabric of their thought. And again, as we face the world of Islam, which stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf, and right down to Pakistan and Indonesia, probably the major parts of the southern half of the globe, again we get a confrontation which defies imagination. For the world of Islam too says that we who took the city of Jerusalem in the 6th century of the Common Era, for us to yield this city to the Jews is something which strikes at the very essence of our thought and of our historical status. And as leading Arabs have told us, give us back the whole of the West Bank. Give us back even large chunks of the original Israel. If you do not yield Jerusalem, we can never live with you with peace. We can never yield this city to you, for if we do so, we accept a spiritual humiliation which undercuts the very essence of our national renaissance and pride. And I said to this professor, here you face some 2 billion people, all in all. For Rome in this issue represents the major part of the Christian world. And they in Islam probably represent the majority of the human race. And here you have an issue and an attitude and a perspective. How do they look upon the Jew today? And they cannot look upon the Jew today. They cannot study him. They cannot grasp his background. They cannot begin the analysis of his return if they conceive of this adventure as just one of the flotsam and jetsam of refugees cast out by Nazism from Europe and by oppression from Middle Eastern countries, unless they grasp the essence of an existence beyond time and a return which has defied every physical obstacle, unless they sense the providential aspect of this restoration of people and land, which is no analogy or precedent in human history. Therefore I said to him, the educated young man or girl in England, if they do not know of the destruction of the temple, they cannot understand the present struggle in the Middle East. If they do not know of this loneliness and exile, the very terms of which were coined with the exile of the Jew from Jerusalem, if they do not know of this, they cannot understand the return. They cannot understand why we cannot yield. They cannot understand this vast circle of world forces as they swirl round this land and city and the heart of the balance of world power. He said he never thought of it in those terms, and he thought I had a point. But for us, one doesn't need to explain it. Those of you who have been here a week, and those of you abroad in the diaspora who live our problem day in, day out, you feel intuitively this new epoch of the Jew, but you feel uncertain as to its outcome. You feel difficulty in analyzing where we're going, as indeed the statesmen of the world are shrouded in uncertainty. And you ask, where are we going? But you immediately answer, having been in Israel, you will march with us into the unknown. Now, where are we going? What will be the outcome of this phenomenal clash of forces across the Middle East and throughout the world? Where do these circles within circle lead? On the world scene, on the regional scene, and indeed within the soul of the Jewish people. Where does this all lead us? With whom is time working? In whose favor can time be considered to operate? I recall last year about this time we were on a world tour. I was privileged to accompany the Prime Minister to the President's ranch in Texas. to your capital of Ottawa, and then to London, United Kingdom. And wherever we went, the first question thrown at us was, where is time going? How can you survive in a vast sea of 40, 50, 60 million Arabs? How long can you hold on to these territories which arouse endless wounds in their souls day in, day out? What is your perspective? What is your realistic analysis? And as we moved from place to place, they gave us their assessments. They spoke of great fears of the Soviet Union intervening. The President of the United States spoke about it. He says they can't swallow this, the Soviets. They cannot tolerate your presence in the very heart of the area controlling its vital communication. They cannot tolerate the humiliation of their allies in the Middle East. And the Secretary of State spoke of the yielding of Arab societies to communism. And he said, because of you, the whole area may become communist, and you will be surrounded on all sides. A tiny oasis, which in the nature of things must be vitiated to death. And they went on and spoke of the Fatah, which was then beginning, turning Israel and the territories into a second Algeria. And they spoke further of King Hussein of Jordan, the pro-Western ally, being overwhelmed by the forces pressing on his kingdom from without and from within. They spoke of the fears of the Security Council considering the problem, and who knows whether they would not have to cast the veto. Could America, for the first time in political history of the United Nations, cast the veto? They spoke of the dangerous balance of forces across the world, and they overwhelmed us with a series of phobias, phobia after phobia. And so we went on to Ottawa, Canada. And there the Canadian ambassador in Washington had reported on the talks in Texas. And sure enough, we entered the room of my dear and dear friend, Mr. Lester Pearson, Mr. Paul Martin in attendance, whom you all recall. And there the Prime Minister opened up with the same question. Mr. Prime Minister, where is Israel going? What of time? Surely time is working against you and against the Western world in the Middle East. And so we moved on to London, arriving there the day the British Empire formally came to an end with the announcement of the abandonment east of Suez of all British installations. And we came into the office, in the Foreign Office, Mr. George Brown, then Foreign Secretary, in his vast room with the portraits of Britain in the heydays of her empire, the great foreign secretaries and viceroys and governors of England, and the whole empire on which the sun never sets. And there we spoke to a constricted Britain as we sat at the table. And Mr. Brown, he suddenly let slip a soliloquy which was most revealing of all the talks we had across the world. For he again started on the basis of the British ambassador's reports, both from Washington and from Canada. Mr. Prime Minister, where are you going? What about time? Don't you live in the sense of time? Don't you realize what is happening to the Middle East? And suddenly, to the amazement of his permanent officials, who sat dressed in every protocol, both in speech and habit, he suddenly turned to himself and he said in soliloquy, now what did I say to the Israel Prime Minister? In one breath, I used the word Israel and time. But after all, and this is George Brown speaking, Israel is timeless. He suddenly shook himself out of this departure and came back to realities and began the regular analysis of all the fears which have marched on us for the past year and a half from every chancellery and foreign office across the Western world. And where indeed do we stand? We have a series of rims of dialogues with the outside world, the various focal points of stands before we survey in brief the security situation. If we look across the Western world, which we consider to be our friends, United States, Canada, United Kingdom, I'm excluding France for the moment, Latin America, Benelux, Scandinavian countries, there at least we have a common mind that there can be no return to the situation before 1967 June, that we cannot again be flung back into the abyss of constant threat and terrorism over 20 years, that never again can Israel's life hang on the thread of the whim of the dictator of the Nile or any other dictator, those which will surely successfully arise, one on the ruins of the other in the Arab capitals. And yet, there are differences of approach, and let us be frank about them. There is no understanding there of the historical links with Eretz Israel. There is no understanding that we cannot yield at any point without clear peace, contractual peace, formally signed. Even then, many people who know the Arab mind say to us, what worth if they sign, tomorrow they will tear up the paper. But at least we can say, if they sign peace treaties, the world has a right to ask us to take a risk for peace. Surely they cannot ask us to take risks for some amorphous document lacking in meaning, which in fact is a political settlement, which can be, in its ambivalence and ambiguity, explained 100 times by Nasser to the masses in Cairo. And so in their thesis we would withdraw like 1957 with something less than peace, something far less than peace, on the basis of international guarantees which surely have not stood the test of validity in the past 2 decades and decades before. As we would withdraw, their troops would move in. Only a few weeks would pass before the Arab leaders would rise and say, we really did not sign anything. We merely settled politically to get them out. But the Palestine people, indeed, as Nasser has said only last week, this is an entirely different province. We could not sign away the eternal rights of this people. All we signed was a political settlement between sovereign countries. We recognized maybe Israel's right to exist, but can we forfeit the claims of the Palestine people? Who are we to do so? And so the drums will begin slowly indeed, maybe 1, 2, 5, maybe even 10 years of temporary respite. But the drums will begin again, and the fanaticism will find its voice, and the pressures will grow, and the arms budgets will increase, and again Israel will bemoan the opportunity, the stark opportunity she had in her hands of maybe getting a peace by not yielding, and maybe for 10, for 20, for 100 years will bemoan the day that they accepted the false undertakings of the Arab leaders and did not stand by their principles. So we have this debate with the Western world. It may grow more acute in the coming weeks or months, and we may be faced indeed, we hope not, we may be faced with political isolation. Let us face realities. You cannot play a cosmic roulette. You cannot play on the stage of world power. You cannot be at the heart of the balance of world developments and expect to get where you want to get without taking risks. The risk of yielding, we believe, is far greater than that of standing firm. As we go to other areas of dialogue, to the Soviet Union, we find in the Soviet Union that with all their animosity there's a slight change, because Soviet Russia till May of last year threatened us almost day in, day out with active intervention. And as I said earlier, In the White House in Washington, this was considered a dangerous reality for many, many months, and even to the present day is not discarded. But since May of last year, the Soviets suddenly realized that they might overplay their hand, as they did in '67, in telling Nasser to move into Sinai, and then not knowing how to block him. And they feared that this growing tension might give Nasser a pressure which would support the pressure of his officers on him, and a conflagration would develop in the Middle East, which would face the Soviet Union with the alternative, either to permit another catastrophe for the Arab world, or to intervene actively and take the risk of confrontation with the Western world. So the Soviet Union, from blustering and threat, has turned to pressures on Cairo against war, and to trying to coax the United States and other Western powers to move towards a political settlement short of peace. I could talk many hours on the various dialogues. If you are tired, I don't want to go on too long. We have the dialogue of Rome and Jerusalem, to which I referred. We have this phenomenal situation where for the past year and a half, while Jerusalem is reunified as the capital of Israel, Rome, which challenged us violently from 46 to 51 on the issue of Jerusalem, has kept its silence. It has not recognized us in Jerusalem. Rome, which carries with it the weight of influence across the entire Latin American continent, with the exception of Cuba, and across the vast proportion of Western Europe and even the United States. They don't recognize us in Jerusalem. At least we can say of them that for a host of reasons, and I believe part of it being this reverence before the unknown, which seems symbolized in the Jewish people, Rome has kept her silence. And neither cardinals nor Catholic statesmen nor newspapers incite against the Jew or against Israel across the world. They just wait and see what will develop. But let us come finally to the last area of dialogue, the dialogue between Israel and the Arab peoples. Where are we going? Does this situation mean one more link in this endless tension? Or is there some hope that something new is emerging in the Arab mind? Does Fatah symbolize the Arab capital? Or is there some hope that the prudence of their policy over 20 years of aggression, of endless hostility, is being reconsidered? It's difficult to reach conclusions, and within Israel itself there are vastly varying assessments. I would say that a paradox has developed as the Arabs move. And all around us, Soviet planes and pilots, with some 4,000 instructors and advisors, and Soviet ships in ports in Alexandria, and not fire a shot. How long? How long will this continue? And so Nasser says, either I get a political settlement, or else I will have to move. And he tells Moscow, either you get me a political settlement, or I cannot control my officers, come with me. And Moscow in turn presses Washington, which in turn presses Yaring and Israel. And so the vicious circle turns. But as in conditioned reflex, the Egyptian army prepares for war, and with it the other Arab armies, there is for the first time the element of reconsideration. For the first time when they meet with each other, the Arabs, they say, are we sure we will win this war as we were sure last time? Are we sure indeed that we can avoid a further catastrophe from our people? Maybe our whole policy has been wrong. Maybe you've not understood this people. And as you talk to Arabs, you find with all the hatred, with all the desire for revenge, beginnings of a mental reassessment. Maybe after all the propaganda of 20 years, this is a flotsam and jetsam of refugees, cast here by persecution and oppression, sustained by Jewish money across the world, and the spearhead of imperialist intrigue into the heart of the Arab homeland. Maybe this assessment, they say to themselves and to each other, has not been absolutely correct. Maybe there's some inner strength in this people which we've not grasped. All their assessments over the years, and I remember these reports for the past 20 years of their secret meetings. Israel will collapse economically. Israel cannot possibly survive with a vast community drawn from 70 lands. It must snap under social stress. It must collapse under ideological division. It must yield under cultural variegation. How can it live, this small Israel, facing up to millions of Arabs? And President Nasser himself, only a month before the war, told an observer very close to him, he said, I will not have to fight this people, for the very logic of time will vitiate their existence. There's an Arab minority of proportions growing in Israel. The Jews within Israel must clash. What he called them. How long, he said, can this phenomenal unity with our people abroad continue?